Hi, everyone. Welcome to the May meeting of the Linnean Society of New York. I'm Debbie Mullins, the president, and I call this meeting to order. I'm really looking forward to tonight's program. I had an opportunity to see some of Dr. Patricelli's amazing video footage of sage-grouses, and it's going to be really interesting. Tonight is our last program meeting of the year. We'll take a break over the summer and begin next season's meetings on September the 10th. We've been seeing some great birds on our Central Park migration walks on Tuesday mornings. The last two walks of the season are on May 21st and May 28th. These walks are free and open to the public, but please do sign up in advance on our website if you'd like to attend. We aim to have no more than 15 people in each group, so we need an accurate head count in order to have enough leaders lined up to accommodate the group. Our Conservation Committee has arranged for the Linnean Society to do a service project with the Central Park Conservancy on Saturday, June the 1st at 10 o'clock. We'll assist Conservancy staff with work in the Hearns Head and Triplets Bridge area of Central Park. To participate, please sign up on the Conservancy's website using the link that was in the email you received from me last Thursday. Last week, you were asked to vote on two motions, one to approve the minutes of the April meeting and the second to approve the membership applications of 12 new members. The minutes were approved with 127 in favor, none opposed, and 2 abstaining. The new member applications were approved by a vote of 127 in favor, 1 opposed, and 1 abstaining. Please join me in welcoming these new members. Jenny Landsman, sponsored by Amanda Bielskis, Daniel Landsman, also sponsored by Amanda, Gail Denter Gottlieb, sponsored by Lisa Curtis, Norman Krause, sponsored by Corrine Mitchell, Elaine Lavin, sponsored by Kristen Ellington, Carol Major, sponsored by Jane Ellison, Bonnie Eisner, sponsored by Mindy Kaufman, Jane Hoffer, sponsored by Joyce Wright, Lisa Borg, sponsored by Amanda Bielskis, Janae Wong, sponsored by Chuck McAlexander, Marcia Newman-Klug, sponsored by Miriam Rakowski, and Elijah Schiffer, sponsored by myself. I extend a warm welcome to all these new members. I hope to meet you at an upcoming event or field trip, and I hope you'll get involved in some of the Society's ongoing activities. I invite everyone who's watching tonight who's not a member to join. The membership application is on our website, linneannewyork.org/member. If you don't know anyone in the Society to sponsor you, I would be happy to do so. So now let's turn to our program. As usual, we've disabled your microphone and the chat function, so please use the Q&A feature to submit questions for Dr. Patricelli. Following her presentation, Vice President Doug Futuma will moderate a question and answer session. Gail Patricelli is a professor in the Department of Evolution and Ecology and chair of the Animal Behavior Graduate Group at the University of California, Davis. She received her bachelor's degree in biology and art from Whitman College and her PhD from the University of Maryland. She was a postdoctoral fellow at the Cornell University Lab of Ornithology. Professor Patricelli and members of her lab studied the evolution and elaborate courtship behaviors in birds and the impacts of human activities, especially noise pollution, on bird communication, breeding behaviors, and reproductive success. Much of the research in the Patricelli lab addresses sexual selection and the breeding ecology of a species of conservation concern, the Greater Sage-Grouse. The lab adapts technology such as biomimetic robotics, microphone arrays, acoustic monitoring, and remote telemetry to study wild populations of sage-grouse and other bird species. So Dr. Patricelli, welcome to the Linnaean Society.
Thank you. Okay, let me set up my screen here. Okay. Do you mind just confirming that you're seeing the correct screen, not my presentation view?
In presentation mode.
Oh, you are. Okay.
Yeah, with your notes.
There we go.
Yep, looks great. Thank you.
Okay. And then let me just hide these. Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. If the presentation is, if you're looking at the right presentation. So I'm happy to be here today. It's an honor to talk to you all. And I'm going to start today by just giving you a brief overview of some of the research at my lab, starting with our basic studies of courtship behavior and in the sage-grouse, and then talking about how these basic studies inform our more applied work on conservation. So there's a lot of co-authors of the work I'll be talking about today, and I will highlight them on the side of the slides with photos and names here. Many of them are current and former graduate students who got their PhD or are working on their PhD in my lab or postdocs in the lab, as well as collaborators from other institutions. So there's a lot of work that goes into the work I'll be telling you about today. Okay. There we go. Okay, so Darwin's theory of natural selection is, of course, very powerful in explaining traits like the camouflage coloration that helps animals to avoid predators. So many of you are probably spotting the different animals here. So we have the common patu and chick. There's a common barren caterpillar, sorry, right in the middle of the leaf here. And then the common leaf gecko, which is hiding in plain sight right here. And so these are just extraordinary examples of the power of natural selection to shape traits, in that case to avoid predators. But the theory of natural selection alone has a more difficult time explaining animals like the peafowl, where peacocks seem to be doing everything they can to be seen, with songs, dances, colors, and all sorts of things. And so Darwin himself proposed the solution to this problem. He proposed the theory of sexual selection, which explains the evolution of these traits that improve competition over mates. And now we know that that males have these elaborate displays because peahens demand it. So the peahen is the real artist here, who over evolutionary time, through her mate choice decisions, has shaped these gorgeous creatures that we see when we look at the males in their full splendor of display. Females prefer to mate with males who have more eye spots on their train. So that's one of the key traits that sexual selection seems to favor, as well as a host of other things. But courtship doesn't just consist of the male unfurling his train and the female counting eye spots. Courtship in peafowl and all sorts of other species, from fish, birds, insects, spiders, all sorts of creatures. Courtship's often more like a negotiation than an advertisement. So there's all sorts of things that males and females have to do for courtship to work. And from the male's perspective, they need to be able to choose a location and a partner for courtship. They need to approach the female that they intend to court and interact appropriately. And they need to produce their most attractive display given female preference, which might vary among females, and the market context. So, depending on what other males are doing. And they need to do all that within the boundaries of any mechanical and energetic constraints they may have. So they have to use the fuel that they have well in order to gain matings. And so these are all complex tasks. And individuals may differ in their skill of execution of those tasks. So their ability to gather information and make choices to maximize their success in mating. So to maximize their fitness. And so sexual selection may favor not just elaborate traits like the peacock's train, but also social skills, right? Behavioral skills such as social skills that are needed to execute courtship successfully. And so, for example, in this peacock spider, males need to have gorgeous colors and dances, and they need to perform courtship while the female chases them. And if she catches the male before she's convinced him, or before he's convinced her to mate, then she will eat him. So he's dancing for his little life. And clearly, this is an extreme case. In most species, failure leads to rejection, not death. But if you're interested in understanding sexual selection in peacock spiders, and you only measure color and dance behavior under controlled conditions, you'd be missing a great deal of what makes some males more successful at mating and passing on their genes to the next generation than other males. So you'd be missing many of the traits that sexual selection is shaping. And so, to study sexual selection on the trait, what we typically want to do is measure variation in that trait and then look at how that relates to fitness. So variation among individuals in their success at reproducing. And very few studies have done this with these kinds of social skills in courtship because it's very hard to do. So in order to do this, we need to be able to collect detailed measurements of subtle male and female behaviors, of the social context, etc. And we need to know the optimal behavior, what the optimal behavior is, or have some good measure of fitness. And importantly, when you're looking at social skills and communication in particular, you need to be able to determine who is responding to whom in these interactions. So in order to figure out whether the male's responding to the female or the female and the male, you need some sort of way to experimentally control that interaction. And ideally, what you would want to do is manipulate the behavior of one side of that conversation and measure the responsiveness of the other side. And so I've been doing this in my research since I got started through my PhD research on satin bowerbirds, which are the amazing birds that you're seeing up here. And in this species, the male is doing his display and the female is inside the bower watching the male. And I developed a robotic female bowerbird so I could control the female behavior and measure the responsiveness of the male. And it turned out to be equal in importance, his ability to respond to female signals and cues. It turned out to be equal in importance to the ability to make an attractive bower and decorate it and do a nice song and dance. So these social skills are very important. But only a handful of studies have done this for courtship so far because it's just very difficult to do. And so courtship interactions are difficult to study when you're just focused on a pair of individuals, but it's even more complex when you when you look at this in the social and environmental conditions in which they actually occur in nature. And that's especially true of lek breeding species like the sage-grouse. So a lek is a breeding ground where males gather to puff up and strut around and show off, and females gather to comparison shop for a mate. And so what you're seeing here in this image is one of the largest remaining leks anywhere of the Greater the species I'll be talking about today. And these white spots that you're seeing in the image are all males who are puffed up and strutting. The females are also there, but they are very hard to see. They're well camouflaged and they just sort of blend into the sagebrush. But the key feature of the lek is that males don't provide parental care in lekking species. And so after the female makes her decision of who she wants to mate with on the lek, she leaves and takes care of the young, and the male stays and keeps courting the next female that he finds. And so this leads to strong sexual selection by female choice, and it leads to the evolution of all sorts of over-the-top elaborate displays. So thinking of the peacocks and birds of paradise and mannequins and all sorts of other spectacular lek breeding species. Oh, sorry, I'm getting my computer to move to the next slide. Let's see. There we go. Okay. In my lab, we've been using sage-grouse as a model system to examine sexual selection on these kinds of social skills that are important in courtship. And in particular, I'll tell you about some of the early experiments that we did looking at male response to female cues and signals during courtship. And then next, I'll pivot and start talking about how that basic research on courtship behavior informs our more conservation-focused research. So I'll talk a little bit about how diet quality and foraging behavior affects courtship and mating success, and how this relates to conservation of the species. And I'll talk a little bit about our ongoing work on wildfire impacts on foraging, diet, and courtship behavior. And so, I'm an animal behaviorist. My PhD is in biology. I'm an evolutionary biologist by training. And so why study conservation? Why is it that most of the research in my lab right now is focused on conservation? Greater sage-grouse, the species I'll talk about today, populations have declined by 95%. The estimates suggest that they've gone from more than 16 million birds at the time they were first described to Western science, and have dropped down to 200 to 500,000 birds. And they've lost about 56% of their habitat. And so they have been the focus of one of the biggest conservation efforts in US history, but they're still declining. So we have yet to turn that around. And if we can't turn that around and they end up needing to be listed as an endangered species, a listing decision would affect 65 million acres in 11 states. So you can imagine that the politics of this are very complicated. And I'm more than happy to come back and talk about this in the Q&A, some aspects of the sort of pros and cons of something like a listing decision. And so another question one might ask, and this is a question I get fairly often when I'm interacting with colleagues in the conservation community, which is, with all the conservation issues facing sage-grouse and other species like them, why study courtship behavior? Why focus on sexual selection? And my main reason for this is to better understand our world. I find value in understanding how things work in the world, how processes like evolution work. So that's one of my major motivations, is curiosity about how the world works. But basic research also informs conservation. And so there's a lot we don't know about the breeding biology and habitat needs of sage-grouse that are preventing us from successfully stopping the declines that we're seeing. So understanding their basic behavior is also important from a conservation perspective. Okay, so I'll talk about research that we've been doing at a few different field sites, and most of the work I'll talk about today was from our field site in Lander, Wyoming, which is a beautiful patch of the Rocky Mountains in just on the east side of the Rocky Mountains in Wyoming. We also, more recently, were working in the Eastern Sierras in California. Absolutely beautiful locations over there. And most recently, we've had field sites in the Santa Rosa Mountains in Nevada. So sage-grouse are wonderful for lots of reasons, including that they have excellent taste in field locations. Let's see. Okay. So in our site in Wyoming, we would head out to the field every year and set up our own little trailer park in the middle of nowhere, out basically trying to be as close as we can to the birds that we're studying. As you can see by the snow on the ground here, it's often very difficult to get around in a lot of these locations, so we try to be close. And we go out there with field crews of people who have helped us do this work. So we've had a lot of people. It's a particularly epic field crew photo that year. We've had a lot of people who have helped us collect this data in the field. And then we come back to UC Davis with hundreds of hours of video, and we've had over 400 undergraduates help us watch these videos and analyze the data. So there's a lot of people who have put in work to get the results I'll talk about today. And we are out there to study the behaviors of sage-grouse on leks. And so I'm going to show you a time lapse of a peak day of breeding on a lek called cottontail lek. And the video is going to play at 32 times speed, but the audio is in real time. So this is what it sounds like on a peak day of breeding on a sage-grouse lek. And we're going to see lots of hens gathered around. They are the dark birds there. And you see lots of males displaying, and only one or two of those males are doing any of the matings. So males gather like this and strut for a few months every year during the breeding season. They're out there for a few hours every morning during that breeding season and performing this display. Females usually breed at around the same time. So we get these sort of crazy days like this where there's just a huge amount of breeding activity. The rest of the year is not quite so intense. But here they stayed on the lek for a few hours that morning and then got scared away by a northern harrier that flew overhead. Okay, so this is what that looks like. So I talked about how in lek breeding systems, you can end up with the evolution of over-the-top displays. And like the peacock and manakins and birds of paradise. So this is what the over-the-top display looks like in sage-grouse. So this is some high-speed video that we collected on a sage-grouse lek. And what you're going to see here is the male running across the snow very dramatically to perform a strut display. And you're going to see it first in real time. You'll hear another male displaying in the background, but you'll see it in real time, and then you'll see the super slow-mo version. So the first thing you're going to hear is the male swishing his feathers across, his wings across modified feathers on his chest, making a sh sound. And then after that, you'll hear a vocal sound that's produced in the syrinx, like most birds, but it radiates from the vocal sacs, like a weird frog. Okay, so you can see that the display is over the top and deeply weird and obscene. So if you're anything like most of the audience that I've played this video for, you're looking at your screen with a sort of shocked look on your face. And it's just a very weird display, but that is what female sage-grouse want to see during courtship. And so, again, I'll start out by talking about how we've been using them as a model system to examine sexual selection on behavioral skills, these social skills, and a focus on male response to female cues and signals during courtship. And so before I get started on that, I just want to emphasize what I'm talking about when I say that sexual selection is very strong on a lek. So the day that I was out there sitting on the lek in a hunting blind so I could film the birds and interact up close, this male that you see in the middle of the screen here, he is surrounded by hens. And so this male was our all-time mating champion. And he mated well over 130, I think 140 times during that mating season as a whole. And 37 of those mating events happened on the morning that you see here while I was sitting out there watching. And 23 of those copulation events happened in a single 23-minute long period of time, during which he mated once a minute for 23 straight minutes. It was very impressive. And so the point being that if males are successful, if they can be the one that the females want to mate with in that year, they are passing on their genes to many, many different offspring, right? They're going to have a lot of offspring represented in the next generation. And so that is what leads to such strong sexual selection and such over-the-top elaborate displays. So what do we know about sexual selection in sage-grouse? They've been studied since the 70s. There have been a lot of different people who've contributed to what we know about sage-grouse. And what we've seen is that females are extremely picky. They almost all want to mate with the same few males, but it doesn't seem to be about looks. So interestingly, at least nothing that we've been able to measure so far is correlated with mating success. That's a part of the visual display. So successful males, the most important thing is to show up and work hard. So they display at a high quantity, they spend more days on the lek, and when they're on the lek, they strut at a higher rate, and a higher quality. So they sound good. There's particular features of the vocalizations that females like. And we know that these displays are energetically costly, and previous studies suggested that there might be a trade-off between quality and quantity. So males be able to strut a lot at a high rate, or strut well, making a display that sounds good, but doing both of those things is very hard. Quantity-quality trade-offs are very common. And so in one of our first experiments, we tested the hypothesis that males might manage that trade-off by tactically using their energy when it's most likely to lead to actual matings. And that is when females are close. So based on previous research, we know that when females are close to a male, that's when they're really assessing the display rate and display quality, and when they're making their mate choice decisions. So we tested the hypothesis that the successful males would wait until the female is close before really ratcheting up their displays. And so, again, we needed a robot. We needed some way to control female proximity, how close she is to the male. And so this is the first generation robot. She was pretty crude. This is me making her in the field. I've learned taxidermy. This is one of these, all biologists end up learning skills that they never anticipated. And for me, that's taxidermy. Whoops, there, okay, there we go. So this is the first generation robotic female sage-grouse, and she moved on G-scale model train tracks that we would set up the day before, and she allowed us to control female presence or absence on the lek. We did these on days when there were no females visiting the lek, no real females, and it allows us to control proximity to males, so we could see how males adjust their display effort as the female gets closer in a controlled way. And you may be wondering, did they fall for that? she is on train tracks, she doesn't have legs. There's all sorts of reasons why you might imagine that males might not fall for this, but yes, they did fall for this. And so males are very keyed up to mate during the breeding season, and they are not very choosy. So when there are no real or robotic females around, we often see males trying to copulate with dried cow pies, which are just sort of brown and round. And so they're really not terribly discriminating. So the robot had to be more attractive than a cow pie in order to elicit actual courtship behavior. But the bar is pretty low for this. Building a male robot that could fool a female, on the other hand, would be impossible. Oops, let me introduce that. Okay, so here's a video from the onboard robot camera. So there's a little video camera right there. And this shows one of our very first experiments. So that particular experiment was not successful, but I hope you'll agree that it was totally worth it for the video. But that was one of our very first experiments, and we learned very quickly that if a male is too excited and getting too close much too quickly, then we flee the scene. So we watched that same exact male court real females, and he was very overly forward, and those females just moved right out of his territory. So this is one of the important social skills that we have followed up on. Okay, so in addition to the robot, we use video cameras to record mating success and the strut rates. We have digital array recording for the sounds. So this shows my former postdoc, Alan Krakauer, who developed this microphone array. So we had 24 microphones spread around the lek with buried cable, and we could get high quality audio recordings for all of the males so that we could measure their vocal quality, right? The quality of the sounds that they're producing. And we do this using acoustic localization. So what you see here is a spectrogram. It's a way of visualizing sound. And that display that you see is a strut display. And that's the same strut display as it arrives at different microphones across our microphone array. And so we can use the time delays of the microphones or time delays of the arrival of the sound at the different microphones and localize the position from which the sound must have come to within about a half a meter. And then we go back to our video and field data to try to link the sound that came from that location to an actual male who was there. Which is a very time-consuming process. But in the end, we have a very complete record of what's going on the lek. And so what did we find? I'm giving you the very, very short version of this. So very briefly, we found that males adjust their display effort in response to female presence or absence on the lek and proximity. And that more responsive males can increase their display quantity without showing a decline in quality and are more successful. So basically, these successful males are displaying much less when there are no females around than unsuccessful males are. But then when the females show up, those males start ratcheting up their display effort, and they continue strutting with higher and higher effort as the females get close. Unsuccessful males sort of just blast away at a mediocre level all the time without responding to that social context. So this suggests selection on this social skill, that males who are better at executing that tactic of saving energy to when it matters the most, when the female is close, are more successful. And so next we wanted to know, do sage-grouse males also respond to female signals and cues? So not just proximity and presence or absence, but what the female's actually doing when she's out on the lek. And so this was the work of my former graduate student, Anna Perry. And she started out by studying natural female behaviors on the lek and basically trying to understand how the females behave when they're either interested in mating soon or not. And what she found is that if you look at the probability of particular behaviors being followed by a solicitation of copulation, you find that when the females are out there foraging around on the ground, which they do most of the time when they're on the lek, they're pecking at the ground, there's only about a 6% chance that they're then gonna solicit a male for copulation. Whereas if they're spending more time upright in the general direction and area around a male, they are much more likely to then solicit copulation from that male. So if a male was paying attention, he could use those signals and cues by the female to target his courtship effort to females more likely to mate. So we asked, do males respond to these differences in female behaviors that indicate an interest or lack of interest in mating? And we asked, who adjusts more, successful males or unsuccessful males? We had an alternative hypotheses that would have predicted either of those. And so this required a new generation of robots. The train tracks were no longer enough. So I worked with engineers and they designed new robotic innards, and this is what they sent me out in the field. It looked like an escaped rotisserie chicken. And then I, with my taxidermy skills, dressed it up to look like a bird. And yeah, it's my own little twisted arts and crafts project, but this is the finished product. So these are our most recent 2 robots, and we can send both of them out onto the lek at the same time. I don't have time to tell you about those experiments, but this is Salt and Peppa. And this is what the behaviors look like. So the uninterested female is basically just pecking at the ground and moving around from different locations, but mostly pecking at the ground when the male is displaying. Whereas the more interested fembot would be spending more time upright and looking around in the general region where a male is. And she's demonstrating here the other advantage of the newer model, which is that she can roll across the ground without having to set up train tracks, which is a big improvement. Okay, so just briefly, we tested 52 males on 3 different leks, and for each of those males, we looked at them in 4 different treatment conditions. So we presented them with an interested robot on one day, an uninterested robot a week later. We also looked at their behavior with real females and when there were no females on the lek. And just like with the last robot, the male's behavior towards the robot is correlated to their behavior towards real females. So we're confident that we're measuring something that represents their natural behavior. And we found, first of all, that males with higher courtship effort are more successful. This corroborates previous studies from our lab and others. And so just to walk you through this here, we have the number of matings on the y-axis here and courtship effort on the x. And this is a measure that Anna devised for courtship effort. The basic idea here is that higher effort is over here. And so what you can see here is that there's a positive relationship, and these are color-coded because you're going to see the colors in the subsequent slides as well. But the key point is that males that are strutting at a very high effort are getting a lot more matings. But despite that apparent female preference for high effort displays, males aren't always maxing it out. So they're not always displaying at their highest effort. So we also found that successful males display more with the robot present and less when either real or robotic females are absent than unsuccessful males. So this is the same basic pattern that we found in the previous experiment that I mentioned. So if you look at the relationship between a male's display effort when there's no female around and a male display effort when there's a robotic female around, we see a strong negative relationship. And so the males that strut the most when there's a female around strut the least when there's no female around. And again, to point out here is that if you look at these dark red dots, these are the males who are mating more, and they tend to be down here where they are strutting more when the robot is present and less when she's absent. So they are at the extreme edge of this, really investing their display when the robot is present. So this is the same basic courtship skill that we found in our first experiment. And then again, we want to look at variation in how they respond to female signals and cues, right? So here we have the change in effort with the two treatments, and either uninterested treatment or interested treatment. And this is the average across individuals. So did they display more when she was interested than uninterested? Whoops. And you can see that they did. So they displayed at a higher level when the female was showing signs of being interested, but there's huge variation in the degree to which they adjusted their effort. And so we wanted to know, again, who is more responsible? Is it the successful males or unsuccessful males? So this is the courtship effort towards an interested female and the courtship effort towards an uninterested female. And the white line here is the 1-to-1. So that would be equal effort in both cases. Whereas males who bias their effort towards interested females would be over here. They would fall on this side of the line. And what we can see is that the successful males, the bright red dots here, are actually more consistent across those contexts. And it's the unsuccessful males who are biasing more towards interested females. And so that was consistent with one of our alternative hypotheses, that less successful males might be more energetically constrained and might invest their energy courting females who are more likely to actually mate with them. And so in sage-grouse, successful and unsuccessful males may have different tactics. In this case, they might benefit from having a different tactic when they approach courtship. And in some cases, we see that there's one tactic and they vary in how well they do it. In other cases, we may see that there are multiple tactics depending on the energy that they have available. And so taken together, we conclude that measuring courtship tactics relative to fitness, we gain a more complete picture of how sexual selection acts on displays. And how sexual selection may favor social skills. So not just the ability to spend more days out there and sound good and strut at a high rate, but also to interact and adjust that behavior in response to the social context, the female behavior, and what else is happening around them on the lek. The results also suggest that the acquisition and allocation of energy is an important determinant of courtship success in sage-grouse. So we found in a lot of these experiments that males were making adjustments that allowed them to invest their effort in a way that was going to lead to most matings. So it suggests that this using their effort well is important. So I'm going to pivot a little bit to talk about more of our conservation-focused research and how diet quality and foraging behavior affects courtship and mating success, right? So we know that diet is important in courtship from our previous studies with the robot, and now we're going to look at how that fits in with their ecology. I'll also talk a little bit about wildfire impacts on foraging, diet, and courtship. So in our experiment with the robot, we found that males show this dramatic seasonal decline in courtship effort. So this is that measure of courtship effort, and this is the number of days after the peak of breeding. And the key thing is that their effort drops off very quickly, about 6% per day for every day past that peak of breeding. These guys are just getting tired. They are working very, very hard every morning during this breeding season, and they are slowing down as the season progresses. So again, taken together, suggests that energy acquisition and use is critical to producing these attractive displays. And that energy comes from their diet. And diet quality may differ with different habitat quality and with their foraging success, right? So the quality of the habitat they're in and their ability to find the high quality food within that habitat. So we know from previous studies that that it's not easy to be a sexy sage-grouse. To show up and work hard is not a trivial thing to do. So Sandy Vierenkamp and others showed that display is energetically costly. So she looked at the energetic expenditure and the struts per day and found that the most successful males tended to be way out here, spending more energy, strutting a lot harder. So it's energetically costly. And they also found an interesting pattern when you looked at body condition, which is our measure of their body size relative to their tarsus length. So basically their fat stores. She found that unsuccessful males, if you look at unsuccessful males, they start the breeding season with a fairly large mass, more body fat, and they're in better body condition, but they lose it as the season goes on. And non-territorial males, males who can't even get onto the lek, start out in relatively mediocre condition and end up really skinny by the end of the season. Whereas these successful males are able to maintain their body mass throughout the breeding season. So they're not losing weight. They don't start with extremely high body fat. They just maintain this lean body weight throughout the season. And there were hints in their results that these successful males might be foraging farther away from the lek, presumably finding better food. So suggesting that diet is critical to powering those displays and their ability to be successful. So this was one of the studies that inspired us to follow up on these kinds of questions. And so we started collaborating with Jennifer Forby from Boise State University to look at diet and the physiology of digesting food. So sage-grouse are sagebrush obligates. So they rely on sagebrush almost exclusively in the winter and early spring when they're doing all these displays. That is all they eat. And so sagebrush, it has lots of protein and fats in it, but it's also just filled with toxins to defend against herbivores. If you've ever been out in the sagebrush sea, you know how smelly it is, right? There's just lots of volatiles out there. And so in her Idaho population, Jen Forby found that birds are choosing patches with plants that have low toxicity and high protein. And then within a patch, they're picking individual plants that have low toxicity and high protein. So if you look at what they're browsing versus not browsing versus just a random sample, you see that the plants that they're browsing have low toxin concentration, which is what this is right here, and higher protein. So the birds are being very selective about what they're eating. And we know that protein and toxicity differ among sagebrush subspecies. They differ with the age of the plant, soil type, precipitation, all sorts of things. There's huge variability in sagebrush. And so with the Forby Lab, we've been looking at how foraging behavior relates to diet quality and how diet quality relates to components of fitness at sites in Wyoming, Idaho, California, and Nevada. So one of the things we wanted to get at is whether males who have better courtship skills, these sort of social skills, are also more skilled at finding good food, so more optimal foragers. So to do this, we've been satellite tagging these birds. So we capture the birds and put this little tag on their back that allows us to collect data about where they are. And we're able to then map that data so we can download it onto the computer, find out where our birds are, and then we can go out to those locations. So you get these GPS locations, you put them in your GPS and walk out there into the middle of nowhere. And then all of a sudden, when you get to the spot, you look down and there's sage-grouse prints on the ground. It's particularly cool when there's snow on the ground and you can really see exactly what the birds are doing. So you can see that at this spot here, they're moving all around and they'll walk right past one plant without, and you'll see one bite mark on the plant. Whereas the next plant, there'll be a whole bunch of birds just hammering that plant, eating all sorts of leaves off the plant. So they're being very selective. You can even see it in these obvious patterns like this. So how do we know what they're eating? We get down on our hands and knees and look at the leaves on these plants. And sage-grouse are the only thing out there that will bite the leaves this way. So they'll sort of bite the leaves in half and show a particular mark on those leaves. And so that's what we can figure out what the birds are actually eating. And so once we figure that out, we collect vegetation samples from either browsed or unbrowsed sagebrush, as well as random samples. We've also been collecting fecal samples from the lek. So in the display arena, so we can examine these detoxification metabolites and corticosterone and other things that you can measure from fecal samples. And these samples have been analyzed for toxins and nutritional content in the Forby lab. So we had a lot of sagebrush in our freezers. And Jen and her lab have finished analyzing it all, and we are still in the process of analyzing those data. So this is going to be the PhD work of my graduate student, Eric Timestra. So the analysis is underway, but just one of the results that I found particularly interesting was that he found that in our California population, successful males make different decisions at foraging patches than the unsuccessful males. So this is the amount of browsing on a plant, and these are the different species of sagebrush, species or subspecies of sagebrush. And these are successful males and unsuccessful males. And so successful males over here avoided basin big sagebrush. So basin sagebrush, we didn't see any browsing, whereas we saw quite a bit of browsing when it was an unsuccessful male. And that is interesting because seeds from basin big sagebrush are the most common seeds that are used in restoration of sage-grouse habitat. So we've been starting to communicate these results to those folks that are engaged in restoration. He also found that successful males ate more mountain sagebrush, so the species right here, and possibly there's sort of a trend in eating more black sagebrush than the unsuccessful males. So they are making different diet choices. And so the analysis of the toxin content of these different subspecies, as well as their choices within that subspecies, that's all underway right now, as is the analysis of the movement data. So how they're actually moving around among patches in the environment. So stay tuned for results on that. So our initial interest in diet was to understand how available energy, right, the fuel they have to work with, affects male tactics on the lek, and to examine links between these skills in courtship and skills in foraging, right, to understand whether these are sort of choice skills, information gathering and choice skills that are present across these very different contexts, or whether these are two separate kinds of skills. But these results also inform conservation and restoration. And so efforts to identify and protect critical sage-grouse habitat and restore degraded habitat are currently hindered by our lack of understanding about what makes good habitat for sage-grouse. So we just don't know enough about what they need in order to better protect the existing habitat and restore the degraded habitat. And we know quite a bit, but still not enough. And so our studies are examining habitat quality at the chemical level, so linking these diet differences to actual breeding and reproductive success. And so we will work with land managers to try to make use of the results that we're finding when we figure out what it is that these birds are eating when they are successful at mating. Restoration is becoming increasingly important, and so wildfire is now the biggest threat to the remaining sage-grouse populations and habitats, especially in the western half of the range of the species. And so for the last few years, my graduate student Maria Ospina has been working at a population in Nevada. Well, before I get to that, so with drought and invasive grasses, we're losing millions of acres of sagebrush habitat. We've lost in the last decade alone, millions of acres, and it's continuing every year. And so in Nevada, the 2018 Martin Fire destroyed 440,000 acres of critical sagebrush habitat, encompassing 35 leks in 4 days. It was started, like so many of these fires are, by a drunken idiot with fireworks. And so this was key habitat that connected populations in Nevada, Idaho, and Oregon. It was a huge loss. And this is just one of the many fires that we have seen over the last decade or so. So natural fires in sagebrush habitat, it's just like our forests where fires are natural, but the size and scale and heat of the fires right now because of invasive grasses and disturbance is just so high that we're losing massive, massive areas. So we're not in a natural fire cycle. So we're examining how wildfire and restoration affect diet quality, foraging behavior, and lek mating behaviors. And so again, we're using these satellite tags on males and females, and we're monitoring their movements among remnant patches of sagebrush and in restoration areas. And we're looking at how plant chemistry has changed post-fire. So this is a picture I took at our field site. And what you're seeing here is a sea of invasive cheatgrass, this yellow grass. This is the fuel that makes these fires so hot and damaging. And then after the burn, it is what comes back very aggressively. It takes over the area. And so this is a challenge not just for sage-grouse, but for all sorts of different sagebrush species, as well as those who want to graze cattle in sagebrush habitat, because it is not very good for cows either. So cheatgrass is a huge issue, but what you can see in this is that there are remnant patches of sagebrush, and many of those remnant patches are quite large. And so we're looking at how birds are moving among those patches in order to persist in this population. So there are still birds out there. There aren't as many as there were before the fire, unsurprisingly, but there are still active leks, quite a few active leks. And so we're looking at their movement among these patches and whether they're making use of these restoration areas, and if so, what kind of restoration practice. And we're looking at whether the plant chemistry has changed after the burn. Did the plants get more toxic or less toxic? And so as populations decline, our work on sage-grouse has gotten more and more focused on conservation questions, but we're still using the knowledge and methods from the study of animal behavior. So our study of display behavior, bioacoustics, and movement ecology. And so we are out there implementing these tactics and learning how to get stuck and unstuck every kind of vehicle in every substance you can find out in the West. And we'll be working closely with wildlife managers and policymakers to translate the results into management recommendations. And just one quick example of doing this in the past, another aspect of habitat quality is the soundscape, so the ambient sound in an area. And this is a part of what makes high quality, desirable habitat for the birds. And we know that sound is critical for their breeding behavior. And so this is one of our field sites on the opposite side of the Wind River Range. And we examine the impacts of noise from energy development like this, natural gas drilling, finding dramatic declines in lek attendance, altered display behaviors, and increased stress at areas where there was an increase in noise. And so we've worked with wildlife managers to set new limits for noise in these protected habitats. And so sage-grouse have been an important model system in evolutionary and behavioral biology for decades. We have learned a lot from these birds. So this is a cover of Nature magazine from 1932, and I love it because it looks just like that guy. So we've learned a lot from these birds, and humans have been studying these birds for millennia. So if you look at Native American tribes that are in prairie grouse habitat, who and have prairie grouse within their tribal range, you will find some sort of chicken dance. Chicken dances are extremely common. And what you're seeing here is the chicken dance of Jace Old Coyote from the Shoshone tribe. And these are sage-grouse feathers in the tail bustle there as part of the dance. So this was an important part of the diet and cultural heritage of people who have lived in these areas for millennia. And so our understanding of what the birds are doing and how they're using habitats that are in good shape, like you see in this picture, helps us predict and manage what happens when those habitats get degraded. So this picture here is from that same energy field that you saw the picture of in the last slide. This is one of the last males on his lek. And this is what that looks like from Google Earth. Each of those dots represents one of these drilling platforms. And it's not just natural gas development, it's also solar and wind, so important developments. There's also the invasive grasses that I talked about that are changing the habitat, fire cycles, and grazing. All of these things are influencing the habitats. And so as the need for conservation action becomes more critical, there's more need than ever for communication and collaboration between researchers focused on these basic curiosity-driven questions and applied questions of trying to figure out how to best protect the remaining sage-grouse and hopefully start to see these populations increase. And with that, I would like to thank all of the many people who helped conduct this research, graduate students, field technicians, collaborators from all over the place, local wildlife managers, engineers who helped build the robot, and over 400 patient UC Davis undergrads who watched the video, as well as folks who have helped fund the research. So I'm happy to take questions, and let me get out of. There we go.
Well, Gail, that was absolutely wonderful. I'm Doug Futuma, the Vice President of the Linnean Society, and I've been in charge of basically inviting our speakers. And my task now is to read questions that people in the audience can submit using the Q&A function. And I have plenty of questions of my own, but we have a big audience out there who have, I'm sure, their own questions. So I mean the range of things that you covered, ranging from what you call curiosity-based science, and that you and I are both practitioners of, to these really important conservation aspects, was beautifully integrated and very, very well covered. Thank you very much for that. We have a few questions, and I encourage other audience members to submit more. One comes from Richard, who says, male behavior is determined in part by sex hormones. Do successful males differ with regard to testosterone levels?
That hasn't been looked at in sage-grouse, but it has been in a number of other species. So usually the males that are out there breeding are going to have higher testosterone. And there have been studies in a few species showing that higher testosterone among males is also associated with mating success. In these kinds of species where they need to fight for a territory and put on a good show, it can impede reproductive success in many bird species where they have biparental care, and it seems to reduce parental investment by males. So there's kind of an optimum amount of testosterone in that case. So unfortunately, I don't know exactly what role that plays in the sage-grouse, but it is almost certainly some part of the equation. Testosterone being one important thing, also estrogens, corticosterone, stress-associated hormones. So there's a whole hormonal cocktail that's in play here.
Mm-hmm. Lucy asks, how do sage-grouse know which sagebrush is optimum to eat?
So
I was going to ask a very similar question.
yeah. I've talked to my collaborator about this a lot, Jen Forby. She's an expert in digestion of these sort of herbivore specialists, mammals and birds that specialize on toxic foods, like the sage-grouse do. They're one of the few species that can eat this stuff, and it's everywhere. So they sort of cracked the code to eat sagebrush. And before we came along, they were thriving, right? 16 million of them spread across this whole landscape. They happen to be very sensitive, unfortunately, but anyway, so we know that it's highly chemically defended, and we think that the birds are able to sense it. It's possible that they're able to detect some volatiles in an olfactory sense. We know that every species we've looked at is better at olfaction than we assume. Most of the time in birds, we assume that that's not a big factor because their olfaction is just not as prevalent in birds as it is in mammals. But these guys have huge nares. I mean, we've been wanting to look at the olfactory physiology for a long time. We haven't done it yet. But one possibility is that they can smell the difference, but it's more likely that they're tasting it. And so they sample the plants. They'll just have a bite or so on the plant, and they probably over time learn which ones make them feel good and which ones don't. So Jen Forby describes this as if you were persisting on a toxic diet, like if we were persisting on a diet of like pina coladas where there's nutrition in there somewhere, but there's also alcohol, and we can only handle a moderate amount of alcohol. You would sort of drink for a while and then you'd start feeling terrible. And so you'd stop and then you wait and then you might have some more if that's your only diet choice, right? And so that's basically what these birds are doing is they're eating this stuff until they probably start feeling pretty crappy. And then they take a break for a while and then they'll start foraging again. So they would be paying attention to the feedback from their own bodies. And they might also be able to see differences. There's difference in UV reflectance from some of these sagebrush as well. So there's a lot of possibilities, and we don't totally know how they're doing it, but it's a great question.
All right. So, well, here there are more questions coming in, but I have to interpolate my own because, as you know, this is closely related to my own field of research in the past on insects that eat plants and toxic plants. And I'm wondering if Jen or anyone has any data to determine if the same birds that are preferred by sage-grouse are also preferred by insects, by the herbivores that are the presumably the major reason that these plants have evolved these toxic and repellent chemicals. So any
That's a
study of the
great
insects
question.
that bears on this at all?
You know, there have been some studies on insects, and we know that insect herbivory can actually cause the plant, it triggers the plants to increase their investment in toxic chemicals.
Right.
So it's this feedback. We don't yet know if the plants increase their toxins in response to sage-grouse browsing in this sort of dormant season.
Well, you
Trying to
and
get it.
she have to get your students out there
Yeah,
and find out and let me know
yeah.
what you find.
But I think there's a
Here's
lot of overlap
okay.
between the chemicals that affect them both.
So we have a bunch of questions coming in. Another from Frank. With blue mannequins, I believe, an alpha male mates and mates while the other males look on for years, waiting for the chance that may never come. Is this similar for greater sage-grouse?
That's a great question. So mannequins are often dancing in teams, right? So they could be teams of unrelated individuals that work together and practice together, and they're like a dance troupe together, and only the alpha gets to mate. The sage-grouse are definitely not a team. They are a group of frenemies that sort of gather together in this big area. And they get to know their neighbors, but they are constantly fighting to, defend their little display territory on the lek. And so they're less aggressive to their immediate neighbors than if some new guy wanders in, but there is still a ton of fighting among neighbors. So basically, I think in this case, they are all desperately seeking to be the guy that's doing the mating, and just not all of them are pulling it off. Whereas in the mannequins, they have to kind of play along as a group until they get their opportunity. So it's a bit of a different structure.
Okay.
But the group as a whole, the lek as a whole, is certainly partly responsible for bringing females in. Like a bigger
Right.
lek is probably
Right.
going to be more attractive. So
Right. Okay. Thank you. Another audience member says, maybe you covered this, and if so, no need to answer, but when and how long is the peak mating season of the birds?
most of the breeding really happens in about a week long period of time. So
Mm,
they'll start out, they were usually going in mid to late February when we got out there, still freezing cold. We are out there in giant down jackets and they're out there dancing. But they'll get started and they'll get their territories established, and then the peak of breeding happens, and then there's a lot of breeding that continues, but at a much lower level. So there's usually one big peak, and then if there's a storm at the wrong time and takes out a lot of nests, or if for whatever reason a female needs to re-nest, she'll revisit the lek. So you just see these later matings that continue on. So yeah, they have the opportunity to mate for a long period of time, but the top guys that mate the most, the key is to be the one during that key week where most of it happens.
Here's more of a comment than a question, but I think you will see the thrust of it. And Edith says, I have heard that plants will increase toxicity when they are eaten, and which is certainly very true for many plants. And of course, that implies that the plants that aren't being eaten now may become the ones in the future because they are not as toxic as the ones that have already been grazed on. So
Yeah.
any information about the sage grouse and that?
That is something we have been interested in for a long time. And we have some data from an experiment where we did experimental browsing similar to what sage grouse do during the season when sage grouse rely on them, which is really before the insects are out much. And we have the samples, we just haven't analyzed the results yet to get at whether the plants are responding with an increase in toxicity. It's not clear that they will in the same way they do during the season when the insects are browsing on them. So we're not sure, but I love the idea that the plants are a player in this whole game.
Mhm.
That there's tactics on the part of the plant and on the part of the sage grouse and on the part, that everybody is making choices basically of investment in expensive things to maximize their chances of surviving and reproducing.
And one last question, and there's still a few minutes if anyone else wants to submit more questions. But this audience member says, thanks for a great talk. Do females mate more than once? And if they do, are the matings with the same male?
We mostly don't have our females color banded. So normally you would be able to tell because the female would be color banded. And so from past studies, it is not uncommon for females to visit a lek twice. So it is possible that some of those females that we see are repeat visits. We don't have enough information yet to know whether they come back to the same guy. In the seasons where there's really one guy dominating, they probably do, and in other seasons they might not. Or if their clutch failed because the eggs never hatched, then they might be less likely to, for example. So I wish we knew the answer to that. There's so many questions where my answer is, I wish we knew the answer to that. We can tell the males apart by the plumage patterns on their butts. When they turn their back to us, you see there's sort of constellation of white feathers, the undertail covert feathers. We can tell them apart from that. We have a whole butt print library and we have them all identified. Females look exactly the same. And so without color bands, we just haven't done that. And we're trying to minimize our impact on the birds that we're studying for all the conservation reasons I mentioned. And so that's why we haven't been tagging them.
A couple more questions have come in. Bob says, with one male producing the majority of the offspring, are genetic defects responsible for the decline of the species in a geographic area?
Um, it almost certainly is important. And so most of the range of the species, like in Wyoming, there are enough birds there where we're not worried yet about inbreeding effects and things like this that you're talking about. But at the extremes in the species, so up in Canada, the range just goes up into Canada, and those populations have been declining for a long time. They're smaller and smaller, and things are starting to get weird. The sort of lek structure has fallen apart. The females are dumping eggs in each other's nests, which we never see.
Mm.
So you get these what are called Lee effects, where you're kind of at the edge and things go weird. And so that is almost certainly partly because of some inbreeding. We also know there's a few populations, like there's one in California where this population seemed to have almost, zero success at hatching the eggs. Like there was something going on there that was causing the eggs not to hatch, and all the surrounding ones were doing fine. So suggesting that there might be something, some sort of inbreeding that might have caused that. So there have been translocation efforts to bring birds into that population, and now it seems to be coming up. But what you're raising, this issue, is a big one, and as the populations get smaller and smaller, we're all going to wish that the females weren't so picky, right? That they would be willing to mate with a wider diversity of males to avoid inbreeding. But thankfully, that's not an issue yet in most of the range.
We have one more audience question and then a comment. Molly asks, what accounts for the location of a lek? Is it a particular landscape? If one is damaged, such as by fire, do the grouse return when it recovers?
So there does seem to be landscape features that the birds like. So the classic lek is like a flat area surrounded by hills on all sides. And the birds have a pretty good view. So if a golden eagle flies in, then there's lots of eyes and they'll have a pretty good chance to get away from it. Whereas if they're up on a hill, that wouldn't be true. So that's the classic lek. And one of the things that it gives me the chills even thinking about this, but we've found in a few cases on the sage-grouse lek, we've found arrowheads that are the particular kind of arrowheads that you see in hunting birds. And that just is amazing to me, because it suggests that this lek has been at that location. I don't even know how far back that might go, but potentially thousands of years in these great locations. Once the area gets burned, the birds do seem to come back to the same spot. And people have had a hard time getting the birds to move when an area gets disturbed. But they do tend to, like if there's a new road that comes in, unfortunately, they'll sometimes shift over to the road. So there is some shifting that happens, but some of these spots are just great lek spots and have been for a very long time.
I'm going to ask a question that I know you could expect of me. And I ask for a very brief answer because we're running toward the end here, and there's a couple of comments that have been submitted. But before that, I just want to ask, here you have this extraordinary bird in which the males are just totally out of sight, with this incredible fan of long pointed tail feathers and this big white display on the breast and these big orange vocal sacs and everything. I mean, this is crazy, okay? And of course, Darwin would have said that females, that these features have evolved because somehow or for one reason or another, females are attracted to or stimulated by features of that kind. Has anyone actually, and you have not talked at all about whether a male's success at all is related to any of his plumage features or any of these others. And just in one or two sentences, do you have an answer to that?
That's so hard to contain into one or two sentences, but none of the sort of morphological features that we've measured so far are correlated with success, but I don't think we've measured everything that matters. I'm sure that there are things that we haven't yet measured that matter, that still influence female choice and possibly the outcome of male-male interactions that are also important.
I think we need more students to work on that question.
Yes.
Okay, so in closing, one audience member has a comment, says not a question, but just to thank you for this fascinating research, so well presented. This has been great. And Michelle says agreed, and Molly also agree. And I also like your jackalope.
Yes. Prominently placed jackalope. I've spent a lot of time in jackalope habitat in Wyoming.
So, Gail, thank you so much for, I agree with all these comments. Thank you so much for a fascinating presentation on just a fascinating study subject. And we really appreciate it very much. So.
Right. Thanks for the opportunity. It was a great chance to talk to a great group. Thanks.
Very good. And with that, we close this meeting of the Linnean Society, the last meeting of this season. The next meeting of this kind with a speaker will be in September, and I invite all audience members to go to the Linnean website. And I think our schedule of speakers for next season has been posted there, and you'll see that there are plenty of wonderful researchers out there, of whom we have heard one tonight. Thank you so much, Gail, and good night.
Thank you.